Okay, sorry guys. I just have a little bit more. Remember, I can only do about 15 minutes of recording at a time, so it cut me off. Anyway, so I was saying that at one point, Victor seems to take kind of a turn in his philosophy, and he's urging Walton's men not to give up on this whole thing, and saying that they're like being disloyal to Walton by giving up on this mission, and that they're do they really want to return home as cowards? Don't they want to return as home as heroes who have fought and conquered and who know not what it is to return on their backs to turn and who know not what it is to turn their backs on a foe? So, in other words, don't you want to return home heroes and be known as those that were loyal? So, there's not really ever an explanation for why Shelley decides to write this into Victor's dialogue, but it may be that on his deathbed, he sees some of the cowardliness in his own actions and doesn't want these men to make the same mistakes. There really is no other real textbook explanation for why he would all of a sudden have a little bit of a change of heart here. It might be that he just feels so indebted to Walton for listening to him all this time and asking him to take revenge for him if he dies, that he feels like this is his way of showing him gratitude by trying to urge his men on. But Walton does tell his sister that he has decided to come home. He says, the men unsupported by ideas of glory and honor can never willingly continue to endure their present hardships. So they don't share the same pursuit of glory that I do. It's not in them. It's not in their hearts like it is in mine. And I can't ask them to do this on my behalf if it doesn't mean anything to him. So he says, I am coming home. He says, I'm returning to England. I've lost my hopes of utility and glory, and I have lost my friend. So he kind of foreshadows that Victor dies, of course, which if you've read, you know. So Victor's story has had an impact on him, obviously. Victor says to him, he tells Victor that they are returning home, and Victor says, do so if you will, but I will not. You may give up your purpose, but mine is assigned to me by heaven, and I dare not. So he feels like it's his duty to God even to pursue this being before he dies. So here, he just is reiterating to Walton this burning desire for vengeance that he has in his last days. He knows that he's coming nearer and nearer to death. He says, during these last days, I have been occupied in examining my past conduct, nor do I find it blamable. In a fit of enthusiastic madness, I created a rational creature and was bound towards him to assure, as far as was in my power, his happiness and well-being. So he's telling Robert Walton here, kind of justifying why he felt like he needed to create the mate at one point, that he felt like it was his sort of responsibility to do that for him. He says, this was my duty, but there was another still paramount to that. My duties towards the beings of my own species had greater claims to my attention, because they included a greater proportion of happiness or misery. Urged by this, I refused, and I did right in refusing, to create a companion for the first creature. He showed unparalleled malignity and selfishness and evil. He destroyed my friends. He devoted to destruction beings who possessed exquisite sensations, happiness, and wisdom. Nor do I know where this thirst for vengeance may end. So, he kind of says, I at first thought that creating the mate for the monster was like my duty to him, but then I realized I have a much greater duty to mankind to not make the same mistake twice. So he then reiterates to Walton, the task of his destruction was mine, but I have failed. When actuated by selfish and vicious motives, I asked you to undertake my unfinished work, and I renew this request now when I am only induced by reason and virtue. So he says to Walton, listen, I know a few days ago I asked you to finish out my revenge if I die, and I was kind of in a fit of madness and sickness when I asked you that. And he said, at the time it may have seemed kind of like selfish of me to ask, but now that I'm in my right mind, I'm days away, hours away from death, I'm asking you with a reasonable mind, please do this for me. Um, so he says that he should live to be an instrument of mischief disturbs me. In other respects, this hour, when I momentarily expect my release, is the only happy one which I've enjoyed for several years. The forms of the beloved dead flit before me, and I hasten to their arms. I'm quickly coming to my death to be with them again. Farewell, Walton. Seek happiness and tranquility, and avoid ambition, even if it be only the apparently innocent one of distinguishing yourself in science and discoveries. Yet, why do I say this? I have been myself blasted in these hopes, so another may succeed. So, he's saying my ambitions and my pursuit of science went awry, but I know that one of my purposes for living is to tell this tale so that someone else may not make the same mistakes. And he even says to Robert Walton, just be happy in the state of things as the way they are, and avoid all ambition. And then here is where he actually passes away. His eyes close and the gentle smile passes from his lips. So he peacefully dies. So now Walton has this decision to make. Do I pursue this monster? Do I do this for him? And just as he's grappling with that, of course, the monster gets into his boat, and Walton finds him hovering over Victor's dead body, weeping and filled with this incredible remorse. And it's just this like shock to the reader all of a sudden, this turn in the monster's whole being. So the monster says to Walton, as Walton stumbles in there and sees him, which again is kind of ironic in itself because Walton could kill him if he wanted to, but he's so taken aback by the whole scene that he can't. It's like he's frozen. So the monster says, "That is also my victim," he exclaimed. "In his murder, my crimes are consummated. The miserable series of my being is wound to its close. Oh, Frankenstein, generous and self-devoted being, what does it avail that I now ask thee to pardon me?" In other words, like, what does it mean that now I'm asking for your forgiveness? I, who irretrievably destroyed you by destroying all that you loved. Alas, he's cold. He can't answer me. His voice, then Walton says, his voice seems suffocated, and my first impulses, which had suggested to me the duty of obeying the dying request of my friend and destroying his enemy, were now suspended by a mixture of curiosity and compassion. And we have heard this now. This is the third time, and you should know what I'm referencing. It's that my motivations, my actions were motivated by curiosity and compassion. He said the same thing about Victor at the beginning when he was listening to his tale, that partly he allowed him to tell him his tale out of curiosity and partly out of compassion for him to like speak, get this off his chest. Victor says the same thing when he agrees to listen to the monster. And now we come full circle back again to Walton doing the same thing in listening to the monster. So it's kind of interesting. He says, I approached this tremendous being. I dared not again raise my eyes to his face. There was something so scarring and unearthly in his ugliness. So he's paralyzed by his appearance. He can't take action. So he says to the monster, your repentance is now superfluous. If you had listened to the voice of conscience and heeded the stings of remorse before you'd urged your diabolical vengeance to this extremity, Frankenstein would be alive. So if you just listened to your inner self and listened to your ability to feel compassion and remorse, maybe none of this would have happened. So he's kind of chastising or sort of blaming the... All right, I had to pause for a second. So anyway, so then the monster says, which is a big surprise to us, that he says to Robert Walton, do you really think that I enjoyed killing all these people? Do you think that the groans of Clairville as he died were music to my ears? You can't imagine the torture that it put me through to do those things. He even says, I pitied Frankenstein. My pity amounted to horror. I abhorred myself. There's that word abhor. I hated myself. But when I discovered that he, the author at once of my existence, dared to hope for happiness while I sat here in wretchedness and despair and loneliness, then I was just overtaken by envy and bitter rage and this insatiable thirst for vengeance. So again, this is how they're a doppelganger of each other. They desire vengeance on the other for almost the same things. The monster feels that Victor destroyed any hope of happiness for the rest of his life, and the monster did the same thing to Victor. So then he says that when Elizabeth died, he didn't feel the remorse that he felt with the others. He said he had cast off all feeling. He was so angry. He says, evil became my good. I had no choice but to adapt my nature to an element which I had unwillingly chosen. The completion of my demoniacal design became an insatiable passion. So he says, now it's ended. There's my last victim. So he tells Walton that he got to a point where revenge and vengeance became the one thing that drove his existence. Again, it's kind of, very ironic because that's exactly what drove Victor. So in the end, he tells Walton that he does desire to die alone, and he will bring about his own death on himself. And he kind of chastises Walton for calling Victor a friend. How can you call Victor a friend who has no knowledge of really what he did to me and what he put me through? And he kind of reminds Walton about some things. He says, am I to be thought the only criminal here? When everybody sinned against me, do you not hate Felix, who drove his friend from his door with contumely? Meaning, like, how come you don't hate the cottagers for beating me up and kicking me out of their cottage? Why do you not hate the country guy who wanted to kill me when I tried to save his child from drowning? That was one of the chapters you were supposed to read on your own, where he saves a little girl and a guy comes out and tries to kill him. The little girl's father tries to kill him. Why do they all get off free when I don't? He basically, he says to Walton, I know you hate me, but trust me, your hate cannot equal with the hate that I regard myself. So he has the same self-loathing for his actions that Victor does in the end. So basically, in the end, the monster literally says he is going to kill himself, and he views it as a sacrifice. He says he will build a funeral pyre in the middle of the ice, and he will climb upon it and set it on fire. He will burn himself to death, and his ashes will blow away in the wind. So it's very interesting that he literally engulfs himself in hellish flames in the end, as if he believes that's where he belongs, in the flames of hell. So that's very symbolic. And it takes us back to the whole meaning of the title of the modern Prometheus, where you have the symbol of fire, and Prometheus, in an act of playing God, went against Zeus and gave fire to man to help them be self-sufficient. Zeus did not want man to be self-reliant, and Prometheus felt sorry for them. So he not only created man, which Zeus told him to, but he gave man fire to be self-sufficient, and that was what Zeus did not want. So it kind of is very symbolic of what's going on in this book, with Victor playing God and bringing about knowledge to the world that he was not supposed to. And so fire becomes that symbol. It kind of comes full circle in the end. The whole idea of lightning being a kind of fire that brings life, and then fire in the end, literally, that extinguishes that same life. That's where the whole thing comes full circle in the end. And there you have it.